Now think about this. If we've been doing a panel on energy in the Middle East and energy policy regarding the Middle East about, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, it would have been a discussion about the politics of the Saudi royal family. It would have been discussions about Iran and the ways in which Iranian radical politics plays into the energy picture. There probably would have been discussions about Iraq. It would have been about oil wells and Aramco and all of the other kinds of paraphernalia that goes with the Middle East energy picture since the 1970s. Not anymore. Now we have a completely new energy map emerging in the Middle East, and that's what our two panelists are going to talk about. This new energy map fits into, in my belief, what in the American shale revolution in terms of an unconventional energy revolution. That what I see American shale revolution as part of a even larger transformation of the way in which the planet gathers and stores and expends energy, which is driven by a whole set of unconventional technologies, including deep seismic testing, as well as directional drilling and hydraulic fracking, and the other technologies that we associate with the shale revolution. And now this new unconventional revolution in energy has come to the Middle East. What our two speakers don't know about Middle East energy isn't knowledge. Brenda Shaffer is adjunct professor at the Center of Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies at Georgetown University. She's on sabbatical from the University of Haifa. She's previously served as the research director of the Caspian Studies program at Harvard University. She served as an advisor on the government of Israel's Zemach Committee on Natural Gas Policy. She's testified in front of Congress. And she's really, I think, one of the leading experts and one of the people who can really sort out the enormously complicated issues relating to recent gas discoveries and the shifting geopolitical alliances in the Eastern Mediterranean. Nikos Tsafos is president and chief analyst of Analytica. This is how I want to pronounce it. And I will pronounce it that way forever.
You got Tsafos very well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's a company he co-founded in 2014 to help organizations use data and analytics to advance energy projects. But he's also a brilliant columnist. He's an adjunct lecturer at the Johns Hopkins School over here at SAIS, where he teaches a course on natural gas. And whenever any issues come up with regard to the internal dynamics and politics of OPEC, it's to Nikos that I turn for more information and for more discussion about it. And so without further ado, I'd like to hear from, and I'm sure we all do, like to hear from our two panelists. Brenda is going first, is that right?
Yeah. So thank you, Arthur, for inviting us to be part of this really fascinating series of events and at this beautiful venue here at the Hudson Institute. It's really, really gorgeous view here on Washington, D.C. First thing for the main, some overreaching geopolitical implications of this revolution. One, I think that even though it really shouldn't matter, it does feed into a theme in U.S. foreign policy and, to a certain extent, to European foreign policy that the Middle East is dispensable. You know, if we don't need the oil anymore, we don't need to be there. And I think, anyone, obviously, if you know anything about how the global oil market works, well, of course, the continued supplies from the Middle East, even if they're not important to the United States, they're crucial to the global energy market and to the price. And of course, the main reason for the U.S. to be engaged in the Middle East is if you're not engaged in the Middle East engages you. You can't disengage. This morning in Brussels is a reminder how Middle East will find you even if you're not there. But I think it does feed into this narrative that we can disengage from the Middle East. And I think more importantly, here in the region, this sense that the U.S. isn't interested in the region anymore because of oil, and even some of the non-oil producers. You even hear this theme in Israel a bit, that the U.S. has waning interest in the Middle East because of the lack of interest in oil. I think it's a myth, but I think it does. I think that it does feed a lot of the thinking in the region. A couple things on the effect on the global oil market. One, I think it's important to remember that the relative portion of OPEC, and I think Nikos will expand on this in his presentation, the relative portion of OPEC and global oil production has been steeply declining, since its height in the 1970s. If in the 1970s OPEC was responsible for 60% of global oil supply, today it's closer to 37%. And even we can make the claim that even the height of OPEC's power, that OPEC wasn't really OPEC. That even the Arab oil boycott in the end ended up hurting the Arab producers more than it ended up hurting actually the consumers economically in the end of the day. But basically, when we're entering into this current part of the low oil price in this cycle, there has been, I think, also again another myth that OPEC decided not to ramp up, not to cut back production, as if it had a decision. I think there was no decision here precisely because of the balance between OPEC production and non-oil production. They didn't have a choice. It's a strategy as if you have an option. This was not an OPEC strategy. This was just dealing with the reality of the small proportion of non-OPEC production, that basically a cutback of OPEC would have been essentially a cutback of Saudi Arabia, would have only benefited other producers, and Saudi Arabia would have been in the same place in terms of revenue. So I think it's very important that we think about that it wasn't a strategy, but what's happened with the non-OPEC production over the years, which has been greatly amplified by the shale production, has really put OPEC in a much more moderate place. Where we're going to be in terms of a future market, in terms of the role of OPEC versus non-OPEC production, I think is a very big question mark, which will depend on how indeed resilient and flexible the North American production is. And I think we really don't have an answer yet about how easily we can shut this on and off, not in terms of technology, because there, of course, we can, but in terms of finance. How much after these companies are collapsed, after the vulture capitalists have eaten their prey, how easily it will be to reactivate these companies and their activities. And this will be, so knowing this will let us know whether the new swing producer is actually the North American production, right? Will it be the one that responds to price signals quicker and revs up and reduces production? Or actually we might find ourselves after this whole period where really the non-OPEC production has really grown, we might find ourselves more dependent, if it's the long, low price cycle, more dependent on Middle East oil, almost paradoxically, because it will be, of course, because it's the cheapest production, it'll be the last production to fall, because it's the only economic vector in the game. So that's what these countries, what they're going to invest in is in their oil production. So we might find ourselves at this end of this oil cycle, instead of actually having, even more the importance of shale, actually having hurt the non-OPEC production and being more dependent on Middle East oil. Again, it can go either way, and it's a trend we should watch. In terms of gas, also the implications are quite dramatic. So Qatar will be, almost within this year, will go from being, the single top producer of LNG to one of three of the top three producers of LNG. So it'll be very close with Australia and eventually with the United States. So that will completely change the dynamics and Qatar's role, both in LNG markets and also geopolitically. In terms of a few things around the region that the potential of U.S. LNG reaching other markets and reaching even the Middle East, I think for one thing, it's helping Turkey to signal to Russia that we have other options. I mean, even if they really probably will not, in the end of the day, significantly reduce their amount of Russian gas, the fact that they can signal through increasing LNG exports, through expediting the Southern Gas Corridor gas coming to Turkey, through talking to Israel about gas, they can signal to Russia that they're not completely dependent on Russian gas. Another point is that we should start thinking of the Middle East and why maybe the competition from U.S. LNG and global markets is actually a very good thing for the Middle East, almost paradoxically, is that we have to start thinking of the Middle East as a gas-consuming region. We always think about how to pull the resources out of the region, but actually the Middle East is one of the strongest growth and demand for natural gas. And it's one of the only parts of the world where electricity is still produced primarily on oil. This is very polluting, very expensive. And that's why we have very erratic electricity throughout most of the Middle East. Places like Syria, Jordan, Egypt, they have frequent power outages. If we ever want to have any prosperity in this region, if we want it to go forward, we need stable electricity. Electricity is even agriculture in the Middle East is dependent on electricity, because if you don't have water pumps functioning, crops, we saw this happen on the eve of the civil war, also in Syria as well. And electricity and gas is essential to really developing desalination in the region, which is already, thanks to the gas resources that have been found offshore of Israel, Israel's already been able to rev up its desalination capacity and therefore eradicate water conflicts with Jordan, the Palestinians. This is essential. In the Middle East, when we used to talk about, well, let's say we get over holy sites, refugees, borders, but what are we going to do about water? That's going to be the issue. And a secret, there's no more need for water conflicts. Essentially been able to eradicate this through desalination, through the gas, and it's very important for the region. I think in terms of the prospects of gas trade from the Eastern Mediterranean into the Eastern Mediterranean, I think that U.S. LNG will not undermine these prospects, because I actually believe in the end of the day, it's most likely that it will be exported to local markets through pipeline. And obviously, there will always be the price gap between LNG and pipeline options. So I think it doesn't undermine these aspects. Some two things for us to watch. One, we're always dealing with the previous problem, right? So we're worried about security of supply of oil when we know we're awash in oil, right? But I think we need to watch North African gas. It's still, as you pointed out at the beginning here, it's still the third largest source of gas into Europe. If you look what's happening in Libya, Algeria, I think it's something to watch for the future, that it's not a given that gas is going to be there, that there could be heightened instability in North Africa. Something definitely to watch. And also another development, that the linking of Europe, our two panelists, linking of Europe and Middle East production through the Southern Gas Corridor. It seems like the Southern Gas Corridor is really ripe to import or facilitate transit of gas into Europe from a variety of Middle East sources, whether it's Iraqi Kurdistan, whether it's from the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think that that will also be a future issue for us to watch. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. And thank you very much to the Hudson Institute for inviting me here. Before I go into my substantive remarks, I should preface with my own prejudices that I'm not a huge believer in the geopolitics of energy, which I realize does not make me an optimal panelist for a day-long session on the geopolitics of energy. And I'll explain what that means, but I want you to think of that as I go through my points. And I'm going to focus more on OPEC and oil and macroeconomics than natural gas, although happy to talk about natural gas if you wanted the Q&A. And I want to make 4 points. The first one is that there's no need to herald the death of OPEC, because OPEC never really controlled prices, and I'll explain that. The second thing is that the Middle East is actually much, much better prepared to handle a downturn in oil pricing. And I think trying to understand what's going to happen to the Middle East macroeconomically by looking back at the 1980s is a huge mistake, and I'll explain that as well. Thirdly, and this is sort of the political scientist coming in me, I don't think we have a very good understanding of what low oil prices mean for political outcomes. That I think you can have an oil shock, but how that oil shocks translate politically or geopolitically, I don't think we have a very clear understanding of that, so I'll explain that. And lastly, when I think about the importance of the shale boom in the US, and I think about its sort of global ripple effects and impacts, whether it's a really good thing or a bad thing, I think is still remains to be seen. There are clearly some unambiguous good things, jobs, trade balances, and so on and so forth. But if you think about it from the longer term, there are really some huge downsides, and a lot of them depend on U.S. policy. And Brenda touched on some of these as well. So those are the 4 points I want to talk about. Let me begin with OPEC. OPEC has really tried to do 3 things throughout its history. It's tried to, for the most part, OPEC has been a liquidity provider. That is a organization that has sort of spare capacity that has increased gradually production to match rising demand. That's been since basically 86 all the way through to the present, with 2 exceptions. That's been the role that OPEC has played. It has tried twice to stabilize the price of oil in a short-term shock. One in 98, 2001, and one after the 2008 crisis. In 1998, 2001, it failed miserably. In 2008, it succeeded. And once, it has really tried to set the price of oil at an artificially high level, at a level that is just too high and where the supply and the demand implications become very pronounced. And that was essentially the period of the 70s all the way to the early 80s. And it was only able to do that by essentially curtailing its own production, either by accident, Iran-Iraq War, Iran Revolution, Libya, a series of disruptions. I mean, it's kind of amusing as well as scary when you read back 1970s oil production disruptions and how you can just take the same country's volumes and just change the decade, right? And then since 82 through quotas, which even quotas really meant Saudi Arabia cutting oil production. So when I think about, and here I very much agree with Brenda, it's not really much of a choice. I mean, you had a choice of, I can either try to provide a signal to those crazy guys in the US to keep drilling forever by accepting less and less myself, or I can try to, not necessarily defend market share, I don't think that's really the motivation, is to say, okay, clearly 110, 120 is too high, but really we have no idea what the right price is. And I can tell you that as a consultant for the last 10 years, the price of oil, and obviously my oil colleagues get upset when I say this, it's a very simple business, right? It was a very simple business all the way up to 2008 and 9. Because what you did is you looked at the Canadian oil sands, you look at deep water projects, and there's about 40, 50 of them in the world, and you came up with what is the break-even price, what price of oil do these projects need to make money, and that was essentially your floor. Well, you come now to the US, and suddenly you have hundreds and thousands of producers drilling left and right, and trying to figure out what the break-even price. There's a huge amount of variation between plays, within plays, and so that's a much more difficult exercise. So I think, oddly enough, what Saudi is doing in a very, I think, in a very sensible way is a price discovery process. We know 110 is too high, but we have no idea if 20, 40, or 60 is the right price. And we will find out when they find out as well. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is looking at the macroeconomics of the Middle Eastern producers. And in particular, I have a little bit of a pet peeve because there's a tendency for people to look at the fiscal break-even. So this is the oil price at which a state's budget balances. And folks look at that and say, it used to be 40, now it's 80. Oh my God, things are terrible. And what's really interesting is that if you actually go look at the numbers of, and I'm talking now about sort of Middle East, North Africa, so I'm including some of the North African countries. If you look at how they actually responded to the oil boom that started in 2003, they responded really sensibly. They paid down debt. If you look at public debt of most of the Middle Eastern countries, it went down significantly. They actually didn't start spending the windfall right away. If you look at government spending as a share of GDP, it actually declined relative to where it was before the oil price boom. So if you look at sort of 2009, 10, 11 versus 2004, 5, 6 versus 2000, what you had is high GDP, high spending, falling spending because GDP increases, and then finally Middle Eastern countries started spending more. So I don't think of it very much as a crisis, right? They reacted responsibly. They had very low debt levels. They didn't increase spending until they were sure that this was a sort of semi-permanent windfall. Ironically, they did so before the semi-permanent windfall proved to be not permanent. And the other thing is, and this is maybe the Greek in me coming in, is when you have a financial trouble, you can cut a lot of things before you cut things that matter. And you look back to the Saudis in the 1980s. They cut their capital budget 85% before they touched things that people really cared about. So what I'm trying to get at here is that you have very high reserves, Some of these reserves are obviously being depleted at different rates. You have very low debt levels. I mean, for the most of the Middle Eastern countries, you have a very high capacity to borrow, including from one another. You have ample foreign reserves, so you can afford sort of a little bit of inflation because you can defend your currency quite easily. And you have a number of vehicles to cope with the danger before you have to do really severely impactful things to your populations. So this is all my way of saying it's messy and it's not particularly clear. This idea that, oh, because oil prices fall, all these bad macroeconomic things are going to happen, the linkages are not quite as clear. Let me now get to the third point, which is the politics of this. And this is, I came to the energy world. I'm a political scientist and economist by background. I came to energy to understand politics and geopolitics. And so 10 years later, I understand energy really well. I still don't understand politics and geopolitics. And I think what I always struggle with is that it's, having looked at the literature and having studied sort of academic studies and sort of the more, layman's literature, it's really hard to draw a very clear line. So you have a country that has less revenue. So we know that because oil prices have come down. Well, is this country suddenly going to say, well, we can't afford foreign adventures, let's scale back? Is this country going to say, well, we can't afford to give subsidies, so then domestic populations and elites get upset, and so you have a challenge? Or do they say, hey, we actually need to make some serious reforms in our economy, and so they try to open up? Or do you have folks that say, well, things aren't going so well, maybe I need some foreign enemies to get people jolted up and excited and have them regain faith in the national leader? And I think if you look at the history of the Middle East, if you look at Russia, if you look at Latin America, there's plenty of examples of all these things coming together, right? I mean, we got Hugo Chavez courtesy of the 1998 oil price collapse, right? So this idea that at low oil prices, you have necessarily politically good outcomes or politically bad outcomes, I think it's completely wrong. And it really comes down to the circumstances, the individual circumstances of each country. And even in those circumstances, whether things are going to turn out for, quote unquote, the better or the worse, I think is anyone's guess. And so I always caution folks that try to make big statements in terms of like, oh, you have low oil prices, that weakens our enemies. It's kind of like, well, sometimes weaker enemies try to be very strong to conceal their weakness, and sometimes, weak enemies may do good things that you like. And so I don't think that's a given on either side. Which brings me now to the last point I wanted to make, which comes down to how do you think about all this from a little bit more of a U.S. perspective? Now, I happen to think that, the U.S. does a lot of things because of the price of oil. And I think that's dumb. I don't think the price of oil for a country like the U.S. really matters, right? And this is I didn't realize it's a bold statement. We can get into it if you want to, but macroeconomically, the price of oil doesn't really make a big difference. So at the same time, what I worry about is the kind of thinking that Brenda alluded to, which is that if the U.S. says, you know what, Middle East, who cares? We got oil. That kind of thinking, or if the U.S. says, you know what, we got gas, let's try to figure out how to stick it to Gazprom. That's the kind of thinking that worries me, right? Because if you step back, the commoditization of energy is a major geopolitical blessing, right? The idea that that molecules flow based on more or less supply and demand principles, tweaked obviously by politics, but more or less, if you're willing to pay, you're going to get energy. And that has been the way that our energy system has worked for a very long time. That, I think, is a public good. It's a great blessing. And if you start tweaking of it, yeah, I mean, you can say that, oh, when Russia does it, it's energy weapon. But if the U.S. does it, it's leverage, not weapon. It's kind of the same thing. And it leads to the same outcomes. And it leads to some of the similar unintended consequences. And so I think what really worries me is trying to leverage this in ways that you have no idea how they're going to play out, or leading to conclusions like the Middle East doesn't matter, and then you have things like Syria where, and I say this as a European, it's going to be no surprise if you were to tell me, in 40 years that the unraveling of the European Union started with the Eurozone crisis and the Syrian civil war. I have no trouble believing that, right? So I think that there's a danger when you try to read too much into what oil means and therefore make political judgments that in hindsight prove unwise. And with that, I'm going to stop.
Excellent.
Thank you. Moderator, I get first crack at it. And my question is this. I'm going to ask I guess you'd call it a technical question. Energy 101, right? This is the way you're always taught. Oil is a global market. Natural gas prices are set by local markets. And that natural gas just doesn't have the dynamics to become a global market in which you could become a swing producer, in other words, in global oil markets by your positioning in the marketplace and the supply. But in natural gas, it isn't possible. Does that still hold true, or are we going to move towards, perhaps because of the shale revolution, perhaps because of a big expansion in terms of liquid natural gas exports and the ability of infrastructure to absorb and to continue to supply gas where it's needed? Are we going to see an emergence like this, or does the old rule still hold true? Either one of you can answer that one, or both.
Okay, I think it could go either way, and I think it's really important because kind of like the mainstream thinking is that, okay, with U.S. exports, we're going towards a global market of gas versus markets of gas, and I do think it can go either way. On one hand, in terms of price, obviously we're seeing these ripple effects and markets affecting each other, which we haven't seen in this scale in the past. On the other hand, unless there's some sort of technological change and the how we produce LNG and the price of it, still there remains this gap between LNG prices and pipeline. And at the end of the day, like all the things that we, for instance, that we discussed in the European panel, like even if you get LNG there, at the end of the day, people are going to want the cheaper pipeline gas, even coming in from Russia. And sort of security of supply is a public good. It's kind of like if I tell you, to buy a safer car. So you say, okay, I think that's a good idea, but I might not be able to afford that safer car, right? So obviously, in the end of the day, we see the choices in Europe. They go for the cheaper Russian gas over most other options. And second, we have to look at the limits of geography. As much as we're interconnected, as much as we have the internet, still gas is about, it's about a physical connection. Even most of the LNG trade, we should think of it as floating pipelines, because still most of it takes place in long-term contracts between a certain supplier and a certain consumer. And so, most of the countries that have security of supply challenges can't even access LNG because they're landlocked or because they don't have the interconnectors. We need to think about not only diversification of gas, so that there would be gas-on-gas competition or different suppliers, but how to use national infrastructure, building storage, building dual fuel plants, a variety of tools we can use to offset even when you're a single supplied state. Going back to what Nikos was saying about different, we tend to, the things we read in the newspapers, the balanced budget versus the oil price. Well, another one of these other myths is the percentage of Russian gas as an indication of energy security. So there are some countries that have, 100% dependence on Russian gas, like Poland, for instance, almost 100% of their exports, and yet because they don't use gas much for the power sector, because of that actually they do good storage and they maintain that storage, they actually have very good energy security, even though they're single supplied. And you can take other countries like Bulgaria, for instance, which have options of local gas, have options of bringing in other gas, and yet because of the way they manage their natural gas sector, they have poor energy security. So even single supplied states can have different ways in terms of security of supply. So yeah, I think we should. It's not clear that we're going towards this global market, and definitely an issue to watch.
My take is I think of a global market in sort of two different ways. If you think of a global market as disparities, right? US 2, Japan 16, big price disparity. If you think of it in that way, the market is definitely becoming more global, right? The price disparity has changed. Interestingly, that has nothing to do with gas, right? The price of LNG in Japan has collapsed because the price of oil has collapsed, and the price of LNG in Japan is still driven by the price of oil. So the disparity between the US gas price and the Japanese gas price has narrowed because of shale oil. Okay? A few years ago, the same thing happened where the US and European markets were connected through coal. Right? You have very cheap gas displacing coal being exported to Europe, pushing down coal prices in Europe, therefore putting downward pressure on gas prices in Europe. So there are clearly mechanisms that can arbitrage between different regions. If I think of a global market in a slightly different way, which is I think of it in the oil way, which is I define it as shocks reverberate globally, right? So if something happens in Iran or Nigeria or Venezuela and the price of oil goes up $1, it goes up for everyone, right? If I think about, are we close to getting to that in gas? We're not. And I think primarily we're not because prices in Asia are still predominantly linked to oil. That's what really matters, right? In Europe, you have a gradual transition. In Asia, people like to quote the spot price and look at the spot price. If you look at the price of LNG into Japan, it's still highly, highly, highly correlated with the price of oil. And until you have a price of gas in Asia that is driven by supply and demand of gas in Asia, you're not going to get a global market. And you're not going to get there until governments are willing to break some eggs in the making of that omelet, right? And if you look at how every region in the world, the United States, the United Kingdom, continental Europe, transitioned from one pricing system to gas-on-gas competition, it went through regulatory push, it went through arbitration, litigation, bankruptcies. It's a messy process. Most Asian countries, I think, want the benefit of cheap gas, but none of the messiness that comes with getting cheap gas.
Gotcha.
Just to add to this, that we shouldn't see necessarily gas-on-gas competition and hubs as necessarily promoting public good, because in the United States is a completely different animal than most of the other gas markets around the world. And when you have really thousands of players and you have the gas being homegrown, you don't have the energy security considerations. Well, if you're an island in Asia, or if you're a political island like Israel, or for instance, you might not want to depend on those type of markets with gas, and we should think of gas. Gas is a utility. There's a reason we call these utilities. It isn't a commodity for most. The way we use it, and for paying for security of supply, and I mean hubs, for instance, in Europe, I think they could be easily price manipulated. They really are not. There's nothing like Henry Hub in any other place in the world.
We have time for a couple of questions before our conversation with Congressman Pompeo. If you do have a question, just wait for the microphone to come around, and I just remind you to identify who you are and to tell us about whatever affiliation you may have that you care to disclose.
It's all clear.
Yep. Question here.
I'm Pete Poroscos with ITTA, and I was wondering, Brenda, if you could share your thoughts on the recent state of play with gas discoveries in the offshore Eastern Mediterranean. Thank you.
As I think in our previous panel, Ed Chow pointed out how long it took for Australian, gas discoveries to end up to, LNG exports. Gas takes a long time, and I think, in the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically in Israel, we want things, very, very quick, and I think there's a lot of expectations in the world that, here there's this game changer, and I don't think things are developing so poorly, actually, and I mean the fact that countries are going through examining their policies and regulatory framework and antitrust framework, I think this is actually a good thing. That again, gas is a utility. So I think the fact that and I think some excellent things that have happened. The fact that Egypt has offered, you see how important offering a good price for gas, how it's had complete, immediate results with the discoveries in Egypt. I think we're going to find more discoveries in Egypt. You have BP. There was a huge investment in drilling right now. So I think any discovery will be replicated by BP and by other companies. And so I don't think these things hurt Israel or Cypriot chances of export, because when there's more resources, it actually increases the chance of export as a basin. But at the end of the day, I think that the gas its main consumption will be in the region itself. And this isn't a negative thing. This is actually a good thing. It could be a high-paying market. And then again, to solve so many of the region's problems in terms of water supplies, in terms of electricity, with 4 million refugees in Jordan, how essential it is for electricity and water to get into Jordan. If there's ever going to be a rebuilding of Syria, this electricity and water will be essential. So I think at the end of the day, most of the Eastern Mediterranean resources, maybe except for Egyptian ones, will be used in the region itself.
Yeah, Ken Monarchard, World Docs. How much of the international oil trade is subject to the spot market? I think it's about 40 million barrels a day that's traded internationally. How much of that is tied up in long-term contracts at set prices or intra-company transactions, barter arrangements, et cetera?
The short answer is I don't know, but when you think about long-term contracts, you may have a volume contract where the price is still set according to spot markets. So So you may have a lot of oil that's get traded on long-term contracts where the price is still set according to monthly or weekly or daily supply and demand. Right? So and in terms of the barter agreements or side deals, I'm not sure if that's oil that isn't traded in spot markets or if there are other financials that change that calculus. So for instance, if I've given you a loan and you're paying it back to me, we may still price the oil that you're giving me according to the spot market. It's just that it doesn't involve the monetary transaction. And for barter, I don't know that there's much oil that doesn't get priced according to those principles, even if the cash element of that, may not be, just me putting money in your bank account, but me repaying a loan or in other ways settling.
Well, one more and then.
Hi, Anthony Livanius from U.S. Energy Stream. What is the impact of the U.S. LNG exports in the region? What do you see as in commercial terms and geopolitical terms?
I think as was pointed out in the presentation, I think the main difficulty is that it's overestimated the impact of it on the region, because there's the idea that again, the U.S. finds the Middle East dispensable, or the U.S. is going to desert us, and these themes that you're seeing in the region. And in terms of gas, in an ironic way, the prospect of U.S. exports in the long term could hurt gas consumption in the region and in general. And I'll explain this. Because the countries are going sort of the easy route of LNG, floating LNG, regasification, well, this is really expensive. So in the end of the day, I think you're seeing some of these countries that are bringing in regasification facilities because it's very fast. It's a sort of a public answer, to energy security. But in the end, they're using coal. So they're like, it's floating there. They're paying for it. Instead of thinking out and putting the time investments, the financial investments into bringing in gas. So I'm a bit concerned about this, again, because of the price gap, that when you see, okay, we have this quick option of the floating LNG, but actually they're consuming very few volumes, and this could actually up the usage of coal or alternative fuels to natural gas. And again, because of the environmental and public health benefits of consumption of natural gas, I think this would be, really a mistake if they give up the investments in the pipeline options in the region or in Europe as well.
If I could just add one thing, if I think of it, it goes back to what Brenda was saying about the Middle East being a consuming region. I mean, if you look from a gas perspective, really you have Qatar, Algeria, and a little bit of Libya, a little bit of Abu Dhabi, a little bit of Oman. But really, Qatar, Algeria, and less so Libya are the main sort of exporters from the region. On the importer side, you have Kuwait, you have the UAE, you have Egypt, you have Jordan, you have countries that are trying to do more imports. So in a way, having more affordable gas can be a very good thing for those countries that are looking to import LNG. I mean, Egypt is now importing LNG, Jordan is importing LNG, and so for those consumers, again, it's sort of a intra-regional transfer of wealth, right? So from the gas-rich that may be earning less for their LNG, but then the energy poor are able to access a new source of energy that is considerably cheaper. And of course, it's also cheaper by virtue of drop in oil prices. So it's not purely the LNG side.
And the fact that the Middle East is both a gas exporting region and an LNG importing region, it shows how the lack of interconnection in this region. The fact that countries don't trust each other to import, gas, will prefer for expensive LNG when they could have easy pipeline options. And I think one thing that's way overplayed. I mean, the fact that Iran obviously sitting on huge natural gas volumes, underutilized, but that is not going to be utilized by its neighbors because they, the lack of not wanting to have the dependency on Iran. I think it's way overplayed how much Iranian gas actually could get to its neighbors. I mean, they've been working on gas to Iraq, which almost is a no-brainer commercially, physically, and and so many impediments even for that to happen.
Well, I guess we could say for the conclusion of this panel that quotation that Mark Mills used in his opening statement, the more things change, the more they stay the same, seems to apply to the energy picture in the Middle East as well. Thank you both very much.